I'm 76 years old, and when I wake up in the mornings, the house feels like an empty chest where all the sound has been taken out, and only the dust of memories lingers. My wife, Margaret, has been gone for 9 years now, and in all those years I have never once felt that I was truly alone, because her presence has clung to the walls, to the dishes she once held, to the old quilt she sewed in her 40s, and above, all to a small jewelry box on the dresser in our bedroom. Inside that box lies the necklace she wore almost every Sunday, a simple golden chain with a small pendant in the shape of a teardrop. It is not expensive in terms of gold, but it is priceless to me because whenever she slipped it around her neck, the room brightened as if she had caught a bit of sunlight and decided to wear it close to her heart. After her death, I began to take the necklace out sometimes in the evenings when I sat alone in my chair by the lamp, and I would hold it in my hands, close my eyes, and for a moment feel that she was beside me again, resting her hand on mine. Eventually, I started wearing it from time to time, not in public, not in some showy manner, but at home, under my shirt, a quiet gesture of remembrance. I knew some people might find it strange, but to me it was no different from someone keeping a photograph in his wallet or a widow wearing her husband's watch on her wrist. It was my way of refusing to let her go entirely. The rhythm of my days has become slow and deliberate. I wake at 6, though I no longer have an office to hurry to. I boil water, grind beans, and make coffee just as a Margaret used to, though it never tastes quite the same as when her hands prepared it. Breakfast is simple, usually oatmeal or toast with a little jam, and then the long hours stretch ahead, sometimes filled with small chores, sometimes with the silence that can press on your shoulders like a weight. My daughter, Ellen, lives only 30 minutes away, but her life has become very different from mine. She is 50 now, a professional woman with a busy job, a husband who is always involved in one project or another, and 2 children in their late teens who rarely have time for their grandfather. When Margaret was alive, she tried her best to keep everyone together, to invite Ellen and her family for Sunday dinners, to organize Christmas with warmth and traditions, to remind our daughter that family is not an accessory, but a foundation. Since her passing, those gatherings have thinned out. At first, Ellen still came often, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of habit, but as the years went by, her visits became less frequent, and when she did come, she often looked around the house with a kind of faint impatience, as if the rooms, the furniture, the very smell of old wood and lavender polish belonged to a past she had outgrown. I am not naive. I understand that times change, that my daughter has her own family and her own worries, yet it cuts deeper than I can admit to her. The sense that I have become an afterthought, someone to be checked on occasionally rather than truly loved, has grown stronger. And yet, even in this loneliness, I cling to the necklace, because in that small object lies the memory of someone who never once made me feel invisible. Margaret was not a woman of grand gestures. She did not speak in the dramatic tones you might hear in plays or films, but she had a quiet steadiness, and in that steadiness I always found my anchor. The necklace, to me, is that steadiness made tangible. Sometimes Ellen calls, usually on Saturday mornings, to ask how I'm doing. Her tone is brisk, efficient, like a doctor making rounds. She asks if I am eating properly, if I am taking my medication, if I have been out of the house. I know she means well, but the warmth of genuine curiosity is absent. And when I try to share something real, a memory of her mother, a reflection about the old days, Ellen often changes the subject or sighs as if I am dwelling too much in the past. Once she even said, "Dad, you can't keep living in memories. It's not healthy." I wanted to reply that for me, memories are not chains but companions, that without them my days would be barren fields, but I held my tongue because I knew she would not. Understand, the gap between us is not measured in years, but in perception. She sees the past as something to be folded away. I see it as the very fabric of my identity. I still dress the way I always have. Pressed trousers, button-up shirts, polished shoes, even if I'm only going to the grocery store. Margaret liked me neat, and old habits stick. Ellen sometimes makes remarks about it. She tells me, "Dad, nobody dresses like that anymore. You look overdressed for the supermarket." She herself wears modern, casual clothes, comfortable but always in fashion. I suppose she feels my formality reflects stubbornness, but to me it reflects respect. For myself, for the day, for the people I might meet. Still, I notice the glances from younger people. Sometimes amused, sometimes pitying, and I cannot help but feel that the world is nudging me toward irrelevance. The necklace has never left the house when I go out. It is too intimate, too sacred. But at home, when the evenings grow heavy, I sometimes fasten it around my neck and let the pendant rest against my chest. In those moments, I feel a calm that no medicine could ever provide. I imagine Margaret's voice, soft and steady, telling me not to let Ellen's indifference wound me too deeply. She always had faith in people, even when they disappointed her. I wish I could inherit more of that faith, but bitterness has a way of seeping into the cracks of old age. Perhaps that is why I sometimes speak more sharply than I intend when Ellen visits, and perhaps that is why she keeps her distance. It is a vicious circle. The more I long for closeness, the more my neediness drives her away. My granddaughter, Anna, is 18 and preparing to go to college. She used to run into my arms when she was little, spending weekends at our house, playing with Margaret's sewing box and listening to the same fairy tales over and over. Now she is tall, poised, her eyes on the future. She hugs me politely, smiles briefly, and then returns to her phone. My grandson, Michael, is 19, already at university, and when he comes home, he hardly speaks at all. He is courteous, yes, but distant. I am an echo of something they only half remember, and I can feel the distance widening each time I see them. Perhaps it is natural. Still, I cannot help but ache for the days when I was not just grandpa, but someone they needed and loved. All of this is why the invitation to Anna's birthday dinner stirred such conflicting feelings in me. Ellen called 2 weeks before, saying they would celebrate at a nice restaurant and wanted me to join. Her voice was brisk as usual, but there was something beneath it, maybe hesitation, as if she feared I might embarrass her. At the end of the conversation, just as we were about to hang up, she added quickly, "And Dad, please, don't dress strangely that night. And for God's sake, don't wear Mom's necklace." The words stung me more than she could imagine. It was not just a request. It was a command, a dismissal of something sacred to me. I told her calmly that I understood, but after I hung up, I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, staring at the wall where Margaret's photograph hangs. I thought of how hurt she would be to know that her daughter, our daughter, considered her memory an embarrassment. For the next several days I could not stop thinking about it. I replayed Ellen's voice, sharp and embarrassed, as if the necklace was some foolish trinket rather than a thread tying me to the only woman I ever loved. I asked myself why it mattered so much to her. Was she afraid of being judged by her friends or colleagues if her father looked eccentric? Was she ashamed of me, or ashamed of the grief I carried openly? The more I thought about it, the heavier the necklace felt in my drawer, not because it lost meaning, but because I began to realize that its meaning divided us rather than united us. And yet I could not give it up. To give it up would mean erasing Margaret, and I could not and would not do that. So, in the days leading up to the dinner, I polished my shoes, pressed my best suit, and placed the necklace in my pocket. I did not yet know whether I would wear it that night, but I knew that I could not leave it behind. It was part of me, as much as my heart or my memories. And if Ellen wanted me to hide it, then perhaps she would have to confront what it meant for me to refuse. The evening of the dinner arrived. with the kind of hesitant sunlight that lingers in early spring, pale and cool, making the world look as though we were still recovering from winter. I had spent most of the day preparing, moving slowly through the small rituals that give me a sense of order. I polished the buttons of my suit jacket, ironed the trousers twice, even though the creases already stood sharp, and shined my shoes until I could see the faint outline of my face in the leather. These tasks were not about vanity, but about dignity. I wanted to enter that restaurant upright, not as some fragile relic tolerated out of obligation, but as a man who had carried himself with respect for 76 years. In the pocket of my jacket, wrapped in a handkerchief, lay Margaret's necklace. I had debated with myself all morning about whether to bring it. Ellen's words echoed in my head. "For God's sake, don't wear Mom's necklace," spoken not with tenderness, but with that clipped exasperation of someone tired of explaining rules to a child. In the end, I could not leave it at home. Whether I wore it or not, I needed it near me, like a talisman against the loneliness that so often presses in when I am surrounded by people who look right through me. By the time I arrived at the restaurant, the sky had dimmed into a soft gray, and the light spilling from the large glass windows created a contrast between the lively interior and the quiet street outside. Through the glass, I saw Ellen and her family already gathered at a round table, her posture straight, her smile carefully measured for the guests around them. I realized then that this was not just a family celebration. She had invited friends, colleagues, and neighbors, people from the world she inhabits now, a world where appearances are everything. My heart tightened because I understood suddenly why she had been so insistent about my clothes and the necklace. She did not want me to disrupt the curated image of a successful, modern family with my old-fashioned dignity and my stubborn clinging to memory. When I stepped inside, I was greeted by the maitre d', who glanced at my attire with polite approval and led me across the room. As I approached the table, Ellen's eyes flicked toward me, and for the briefest second, I saw her scan me up and down, as though inspecting for flaws. She smiled quickly afterward, but the moment had already been seared into me. She rose, kissed my cheek lightly, and said, "Dad, you look fine." It was the pause before "fine" that betrayed her, as if she had been about to say something harsher but restrained herself in front of others. The grandchildren offered polite greetings. Anna hugged me briefly, but was already distracted by the phone she slipped back into her lap under the table, while Michael nodded, his eyes half on his drink. The other guests, strangers to me, smiled with that practiced cordiality reserved for someone they regard as peripheral. I sat down, feeling like a piece of furniture brought out for display, useful only to complete the picture. The dinner began with small talk, glasses of wine clinking, waiters moving with quiet efficiency. Ellen's husband, Richard, told a story about his latest business trip, punctuated by laughter from the guests. I smiled politely, though my thoughts wandered. I tried to share a memory of Anna as a little girl, a story about how she once tried to feed the family dog birthday cake because she did not want him to feel left out, but before I could finish, Ellen interrupted with a laugh that carried a sharp edge. "Dad, let's not go into those old stories. Everyone's heard them 100 times. The guests laughed along politely, but I saw Anna's eyes flicker with something unreadable. Embarrassment, perhaps, or maybe longing. Still, the moment passed, and my words fell into silence like stones into water. The courses arrived one after another, elaborate plates arranged with artistic precision, but my appetite was small. I noticed Ellen occasionally glancing at my hands, at the way I held the fork and knife, at the pace of my eating, as though she were waiting for me to falter, to confirm the narrative that I was an old man sliding into incapacity. Her scrutiny made my chest tighten. I kept one hand occasionally brushing the pocket where the necklace rested, feeling the outline of the pendant through the fabric, drawing courage from its presence. Every time I felt my patience fray, I thought of Margaret's voice soothing me, reminding me that dignity lies not in silence, but in choosing the right moment to speak. It was during the toast that everything began to shift. Richard stood, glass raised, and praised Anna for her achievements, her acceptance into college, her bright future. Applause rippled around the table, and I raised my own glass, pride swelling in me, but when I tried to speak, simply to say how proud her grandmother would have been, Ellen's hand darted across the table to touch mine in that subtle but forceful way. "That means stop," she whispered quickly. "Dad, not now." My words dried in my throat. I lowered my glass, and a silence heavier than any words filled me. I realized in that moment that my role here was not to participate, but to occupy a chair quietly, to smile when required, to be part of the scenery, but not part of the living narrative. As dessert was being served, a cheesecake with candles lit for Anna, the conversation turned to future plans, to colleges, internships, careers. I tried once more to contribute, recalling how Margaret had always believed Anna would pursue something creative, perhaps painting or music, because as a child she had such a vivid imagination. Before I could finish, Ellen said quickly, "Dad, please, that's not really relevant now." Her voice carried a warning edge, and some of the guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. My cheeks burned, but deeper than embarrassment was the ache of being erased, of having not only my words, but Margaret's memory brushed aside as inconvenient. I do not know exactly what overcame me then. Perhaps it was the accumulation of years of being politely sidelined. Perhaps it was the sting of being told once again to silence myself. Perhaps it was simply the weight of the necklace in my pocket, growing heavier until it demanded to be seen. While the room filled with chatter and laughter around the cake, I reached into my pocket, drew out the handkerchief, and slowly unwrapped it. The golden chain caught the candlelight, and the pendant gleamed as if Margaret herself had walked into the room. I lifted it over my head and fastened it around my neck, letting the pendant rest against my chest openly for the first time in years. The effect was immediate. The conversation faltered, laughter died, and a stillness spread across the table like a cold draught. Ellen's eyes widened in shock, then hardened into fury. "Dad," she hissed, her voice low but sharp. "What are you doing?" "I told you not to." But before she could finish, Anna's face crumpled and tears spilled down her cheeks. She pushed back her chair, her hands trembling, and whispered, "Grandma." The sound of that word, fragile and breaking, sliced through the room. Everyone stared, some in confusion, some in discomfort, but all the noise of celebration dissolved into an atmosphere thick with emotions that no one knew how to handle. Ellen reached for her daughter, trying to hush her, but Anna shook her head violently, eyes fixed on the necklace as if it were a portal through which she could see her grandmother again. In that moment, I realized that the necklace was no longer just my memory to bear alone. It had stirred something raw and unresolved in the child who had once clung to Margaret's skirts and laughed in her kitchen. The catalyst had come, not through anger or confrontation, but through tears of recognition from the one person at the table who still remembered what family had once felt like. The silence that followed Anna's tears was not the comfortable kind that sometimes descends on a family when memories are shared, but a jagged silence, as if the air itself had turned brittle. Ellen's face flushed red, and she reached across the table to pull Anna's hand down, whispering through clenched teeth, "That's enough." But the girl was not listening. She was staring at me with wide, wet eyes, as though the necklace had unlocked a door she had not realized was still in her heart. "I remember," she said softly, her voice quivering. "Grandma always wore that when she tucked me in, when she told me stories." Her words trembled into the room, and for a brief moment I felt vindicated, because in them Margaret's presence returned. Undeniable and real, more powerful than Ellen's insistence that memory should be neatly folded away. But Ellen's response was immediate and cutting. She turned on me with a cold fury, her voice low but carrying across the table. "Dad, how could you do this? You're upsetting her. We talked about this." The guests shifted uneasily in their chairs, some pretending to study their plates, others watching with the guilty fascination of people witnessing something they know is private but cannot turn away from. Richard cleared his throat as if to intervene, but Ellen shot him a look that froze him in place. The power in the family has always belonged to her when Margaret was not there to balance it. Now, her authority pressed on the room like a heavy hand. I wanted to tell her that Anna's tears were not harm, but healing, that they were not a wound but proof of love, proof that Margaret's memory still mattered to someone besides me. Instead, my voice emerged steadier than I expected, carrying years of withheld dignity. "She's crying because she remembers, Ellen. That is not a crime. That is not manipulation. That is love." My words seemed to strike her like a slap, and for a moment she was silent, but then her lips curled into the condescending smile she has mastered, the one that reduces me to an old man out of step with the world. "Dad, you don't understand," she said, her tone loud enough now for everyone to hear. "You hold on to the past in a way that isn't healthy, and now you're dragging the children into it. It's not fair to them." Her words, spoken in that rational, almost clinical tone, carried the weight of judgment, as though she were a doctor diagnosing a patient or a teacher scolding a child. Around us, forks clinked softly as some guests resumed eating in a pretense of normality, but the atmosphere had changed. It was thick with discomfort. Each bite and sip performed mechanically, each glance toward me shadowed with pity or disapproval. I looked across the table at Anna, who was wiping her eyes with a napkin. Her cheeks were blotched red, but her gaze was clear, fixed on me, defiant against her mother's rebuke. She whispered, barely audibly, "Don't take it off, Grandpa." That whisper gave me strength, but it also sealed the tension. Ellen heard it too, and her fury deepened. "Anna," she snapped, "that's enough. Your grandfather is being selfish." The word selfish landed like a stone in my stomach. I have lived my life working, saving, giving, to Ellen, to her children, to the household that was always more theirs than mine after Margaret's death. And yet here I was, accused of selfishness for wearing a necklace that cost me nothing, but meant everything. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the weight of humiliation kept my face composed, even as the anger swelled inside me. Richard finally tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, raising his glass and saying something about Anna's bright future, but the diversion fell flat. Ellen was not ready to let go. She leaned toward me, her voice sharpened into a hiss, though loud enough for others to catch. "You promised me, Dad. You promised you wouldn't bring it. Why do you insist on making everything about you?" There it was again, the reframing of my grief into vanity, the twisting of memory into manipulation. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but instead of answering her accusation, I let my hand rest over the pendant where it lay against my shirt. The gesture itself was enough to send her reeling back in her chair as if I had physically struck her. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head, and then, turning to the table at large, she added with a brittle laugh, "I'm sorry, my father gets sentimental sometimes. He doesn't realize how disruptive it can be." Her attempt at humor fell flat. No one laughed. The guests looked at one another, uncomfortable, and Anna's tears had made it impossible to smooth this over with charm. Michael, silent until now, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Mom, maybe it's not such a big deal. It's just a necklace." His words were not passionate, but they were enough to puncture her authority slightly. She turned on him as well, her voice tense. "You don't understand, Michael. He uses it to guilt us, to keep us tied to the past." The boy shrugged. returning to his plate, unwilling to be drawn further, but the crack in her control was visible. I sat back, breathing slowly, realizing that this confrontation was no longer about a necklace at all. It was about the battle between memory and erasure, between my insistence that Margaret's love remain visible and Ellen's determination to bury it beneath the sleek surface of her modern life. The meal dragged on, but every interaction afterward carried the residue of that clash. When I asked for a glass of wine, Ellen intercepted the waiter and ordered water instead, murmuring something about my health. When I tried to cut my own steak, she leaned over and whispered that I should let Richard help, so I wouldn't embarrass myself by dropping food on my suit. Each small act was dressed as concern, but carried the sting of condescension. Each reminder that in her eyes, I was no longer capable of managing even the simplest tasks. The humiliation built like pressure in a sealed chamber. I felt my hands tremble not from weakness, but from suppressed rage, and I gripped the table edge to steady them. The guests, sensing the tension, began excusing themselves earlier than expected, offering polite goodbyes that carried undertones of relief. As they left, I caught fragments of their expressions. Sympathy from some, judgment from others, but none dared to say aloud what they thought. Soon the table was reduced to only family, and the absence of outsiders removed Ellen's restraint entirely. She leaned toward me, her voice sharper now, no longer hiding behind politeness. "Dad, you're making this harder than it has to be. We're trying to move forward as a family, and you keep dragging us backward. It's unhealthy for the kids, and it's exhausting for me." Richard nodded beside her, his agreement silent but heavy. "You can't keep clinging to Mom's things like this. It's not good for anyone." At that, the dam inside me cracked. "It's not good for you," I said quietly, but the force behind the words surprised even me. "You're the one who can't stand to be reminded of her, not because it hurts the children, but because it exposes what you've chosen to forget. You want to erase her so you can live without guilt." My words landed hard. Ellen's face went pale, then flushed crimson. "How dare you?" she whispered. Richard placed a hand on her arm, but she shook it off violently. "Don't you dare accuse me of not loving my mother. You have no idea what it was like. Listening to her, watching her suffer, watching her regret the way you—" She stopped suddenly, biting the words back, but the implication hung in the air like a dagger. For a moment, everything froze. Anna staring at her mother in shock, Michael frowning, me gripping the pendant as though it were the only solid thing in the room. My heart hammered because I recognized the tactic. She wanted to wound me, to rewrite Margaret's memory as something poisoned, to strike at the one place she knew I was defenseless. And though I knew it was manipulation, the seed of doubt wormed its way into me. Because who can ever be entirely certain of another person's private thoughts, even a spouse of 40 years? The evening ended not with laughter or warmth, but with a cold dispersal. Anna clung to me briefly before leaving, whispering again, "Don't take it off," while Ellen stormed ahead to the car, her heels striking the pavement like blows. Richard followed, silent, his expression unreadable. Michael gave me a quick nod, not unkind, but distant, and then they were gone, leaving me standing on the sidewalk under the glow of the street lamp, the necklace cool against my skin, my heart heavy with the realization that a line had been crossed. It was no longer about respectability at a dinner or the discomfort of guests. It was about whether my right to memory, my right to carry Margaret with me, would be permitted to exist within the very family she had built. And in that realization, I knew that the conflict had only just begun. I returned home from that dinner with a hollowness inside me that felt almost physical, as if something essential had been scooped out of me and left behind on the floor of that restaurant. I hung my suit in the closet, laid the necklace carefully back into its box, and sat in the silence of my living room for a long time, listening to the ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of a car passing on the street outside. I should have felt proud for standing my ground, proud that I had refused to let Ellen dictate what part of Margaret I was allowed to carry with me, but instead I felt shaken, vulnerable, and suddenly old in a way I had not admitted to myself before. The words she had flung at me, suggestions that Margaret had regretted, that she had suffered in silence, echoed in my skull like voices in an empty hall. I knew in my bones it was a lie, a cruel tactic meant to wound, yet the poison of it clung to me, whispering at the edges of my mind that perhaps there were things I had not seen, things I had chosen not to see. And that whisper, more than the humiliation, kept me awake long into the night. The next morning, Ellen called. Her tone was measured, too calm, the kind of calm that hides anger like a blade sheathed beneath velvet. She said we needed to talk about boundaries. She said she respected that I wanted to honor Mom's memory, but I had to understand how my behavior affected everyone else. She spoke of Anna's tears as if they were my fault, as if grief expressed openly was a disease I had infected her with. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Dad, if you keep refusing to listen, I may have to take steps to make sure you're safe. You've been forgetting things lately, and it worries me. Richard and I have talked about it. We can't just let this continue." I knew instantly what she meant. Guardianship, control, the slow stripping away of my independence under the pretense of care. I kept my voice steady, told her I appreciated her concern, but I was managing fine, and ended the call as quickly as I could. But after I hung up, my hands shook. The escalation was no longer about a necklace or appearances. It had turned into something far more dangerous, a question of whether I would be allowed to live as myself at all. For several days, I felt suspended in a fog of dread. I went about my routines, making coffee, walking slowly around the block, reading the paper, but everything seemed brittle, shadowed by the thought that my own daughter might be preparing to declare me incapable. I tried to reassure myself by remembering details. I still paid my bills on time, remembered appointments, cooked my own meals without burning the pan. I was not losing my mind. Yet when fear creeps in, it whispers that maybe you are not the best judge of your own decline, and I found myself second-guessing each small lapse. Where I had put my glasses, whether I had locked the door, as though Ellen's accusations had created the very confusion she wanted to prove. It was during this time that Anna came to see me alone. She arrived one Saturday afternoon without calling first, standing in my doorway in jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back, looking younger than her years, and yet carrying an expression that belonged to someone already burdened. She said she wanted to make sure I was all right. We sat in the living room, and after a few moments of awkward silence, she blurted out, "Mom says you're not well, that you're forgetting things." But I don't believe her. I think she just doesn't want to talk about Grandma. Her words struck me with both relief and sadness. Relief because someone else saw through Ellen's facade. Sadness because Anna had been forced into the role of mediator when she should have been free to enjoy her last months before college. I told her quietly that grief looks different for everyone, that her mother thought hiding it made life easier, while I believed remembering kept us alive. Anna nodded, tears brimming, and whispered that sometimes she dreamed of Margaret still, that the smell of her perfume would suddenly fill a room, and she would wake with a tightness in her chest. "When you wore the necklace," she said, "it felt like she was right there. It scared me. But it also made me happy. I put my arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt truly connected to someone in my family, not as a burden or an embarrassment, but as a keeper of something sacred." That visit changed something in me. It reminded me that memory is not just mine to guard, but a bridge that could still reach across the widening gulf of generations. Yet it also sharpened the conflict, because I knew Ellen would not forgive me for planting that bridge. A few days later, as if to confirm my fears, I received a letter from a law office. Not dramatic, just a polite notice that certain concerns about my well-being had been raised, and that I might expect a formal assessment if family members continued to worry. The language was sterile, professional, but between the lines it screamed of Ellen's hand, of her determination to wrest control. My chest tightened as I read it. There it was, in black and white. The threat to my autonomy had moved from words to paper. That night I took out Margaret's necklace again. I did not just wear it. I stood before the mirror, fastening the clasp slowly, watching my reflection. For a moment I imagined Margaret standing behind me, her hands guiding mine as she used to, her eyes meeting mine in the glass with that mixture of amusement and tenderness she always had when I fussed too long with a tie or a button. I whispered aloud, "They want to erase you." And in the stillness of the house I felt as if she whispered back, "Only if you let them." It was not madness but clarity, the realization that the battle had shifted. No longer was it about embarrassment at a dinner or even the shame of being silenced. It was about whether I would surrender the right to carry my love openly, or whether I would resist, even if resistance cost me whatever fragile connection remained with my daughter. That was the turning point. I decided then that I would not allow Ellen to dictate the terms of my memory or my life. If she wanted to push me aside, if she wanted to frame me as incapable, then I would respond not with silence, but with action. The necklace, once a private comfort, had become a symbol of defiance, and in embracing it openly I understood that I was stepping into a conflict that would no longer be fought in whispers at a family table, but in the open terrain of authority. Inheritance and truth. My grief had become a battlefield, and though I was weary, I knew I had to fight, not only for myself, but for Margaret, whose presence deserved more than erasure, and for Anna, who deserved to know that memory is not weakness but strength. The letter from the law office lay on my kitchen table for days, its crisp white edges growing soft and curling as if the paper itself absorbed the heavy air of the house. I could not bring myself to throw it away, though every glance at it sent a tremor of anger through me. It was not merely a piece of correspondence. It was a declaration of intent, a sign that my daughter had already begun moving her pawns on the board. Ellen had always been decisive, efficient, skilled at presenting her choices as inevitable, but this was more than her usual maneuvering. This was an attempt to seize the right to define me, to decide whether I was still a man capable of living his own life or whether I was to be reduced to a dependent, managed like a fragile heirloom too delicate to handle itself. I spent hours staring at the letter, sipping cold coffee, listening to the refrigerator hum, and imagining the conversations that must have taken place between her and Richard, the calculation behind their polite words. They wanted the house, perhaps, or the land, or simply the security of knowing that my affairs were in their hands. More than that, though, they wanted to be free of the nuisance of my grief, free of the reminder that Margaret had once been the heart of this family, and that her absence had left a wound none of them dared to acknowledge. Days turned into a week, and I received another call from Ellen. This time there was no calm veneer. She spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone who had already made up her mind. "Dad, I've arranged for a doctor to come by and evaluate you. It's just routine, nothing to worry about, but we need to establish that you're doing all right." Her tone carried no invitation for debate. It was the voice of someone issuing orders, expecting compliance. I felt the heat rise in my chest as I listened. I told her, slowly and deliberately, that no doctor would come into my house without my consent, that I had managed my life just fine, and that if she doubted me, she could come herself and see. She sighed with the weariness of a parent correcting a child and said, "Dad, you're making this harder than it has to be. I'm not trying to take anything away from you. I'm trying to protect you, but if you won't cooperate, then the law will have to step in." Her words were delivered with such polished reasonableness that I almost laughed. "Protect me," she said, as if stripping me of my autonomy were an act of love. I ended the call without another word, my hands trembling not with fear this time, but with fury. The next day I sat in my study, opening drawers I had not touched in years. I pulled out Margaret's letters, yellowed with age, tied in bundles with faded ribbon. I spread them across the desk, running my fingers over her handwriting, steady and slanted, the words filled with ordinary details of our life together. In those letters was a record of devotion, of shared struggle, of love that had endured decades. I realized then that Ellen's attempt to erase Margaret's presence would fail, because here was proof that our life had been real, meaningful, and full of dignity. Still, the thought of losing control of my affairs, of being silenced legally, gnawed at me. I decided I would act before Ellen could. I called an old acquaintance, a lawyer I had known through church, and made an appointment. When I met him in his small office 2 days later, I explained everything. The necklace, the dinner, the threats, the letter. He listened quietly, nodding, his pen scratching occasionally across a pad. Finally, he said, "You have every right to protect your estate and your independence. If you fear interference, the best course is to put your wishes clearly into writing. Once your intentions are formalized, there is little they can do to overturn them." I left the office lighter, the fog of helplessness lifting slightly. For the first time in weeks, I felt that I had a weapon, not of anger, but of law, something Ellen could not simply sweep aside with her sharp voice and firm gestures. In the meantime, the tension within the family grew. Anna visited me again, this time more cautiously, as if she was sneaking away from a camp where she was not permitted to roam freely. She told me in whispers that her mother had forbidden her to talk about Margaret, that any mention of her grandmother's name ended with Ellen's voice rising at a slammed door. "It's like she wants us to pretend Grandma never existed," Anna said, her eyes filling again. I held her hand, told her gently that remembering is not a crime, that grief is not disloyalty. She clung to me as though I were a lifeline, and I knew then that Ellen's attempt to bury Margaret was failing, because memory has a way of seeping through cracks, no matter how tightly someone tries to seal them. Still, I worried for Anna, worried that her loyalty to me would cost her peace with her mother, and that my fight to keep Margaret's memory alive might become a burden for her to carry. Richard came to see me alone one evening, arriving unannounced, his car pulling into the driveway just as the sun dipped below the trees. He stepped into my living room with the stiffness of a man who would rather be anywhere else. He declined coffee, sat on the edge of the sofa, and spoke in that calm, measured tone I've always mistrusted in him. "Look, Dad," he began, though he has never once called me that except when trying to smooth over conflict. "Ellen's worried. We all are. We don't want to fight you. But you need to understand that the way you're holding on, it's hurting everyone. The kids get upset. Ellen loses sleep. This can't go on." I looked at him steadily, letting the silence grow until he shifted uncomfortably. Then I told him, "You want the house. You want the money. Don't dress it up as concern. If you had any real respect for Margaret, you would know that what I carry is not a sickness, but love." He flushed, his composure cracking for a moment, and muttered, "That's not fair." I leaned forward, the necklace gleaming faintly against my shirt, and said, "What isn't fair is trying to erase your mother-in-law so you can sleep easier at night. What isn't fair is using the law to silence a man who has given everything to this family." His eyes flickered away, and he stood quickly, muttering something about not wanting an argument. When he left, I watched his car disappear down the road, my anger sharp, but my resolve sharper. In the days that followed, I finalized changes to my will. The lawyer guided me through the process, and with every line we drafted, I felt a little of my strength return. I decided that Margaret's necklace, along with her letters, clothes, and keepsakes, would not be left to Ellen at all. Instead, I arranged for them to be donated to a small local museum that often displayed personal artifacts from ordinary families, preserving the stories of lives that would otherwise be forgotten. The house itself, rather than going directly to Ellen, would be sold after my passing, with part of the proceeds going into a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. To my grandchildren, I would leave letters I began writing each night, filled not with bitterness, but with stories, memories, lessons, so that one day they might understand who I was beyond the version their mother tried to present. It was not revenge, but clarity, a way of ensuring that Margaret's presence would live on, not as an embarrassment, but as history. Ellen must have sensed something because her calls grew more frequent, her tone shifting from icy control to brittle desperation. One evening she came herself, standing in my doorway with Richard at her side, her face tight with suppressed fury. She accused me outright of conspiring against her, of poisoning Anna against her, of undermining the family. "Do you want us to hate you?" she shouted, her composure snapping. "Do you want to destroy what little family you have left?" I stood in the doorway, Margaret's necklace visible in the light of the hallway lamp, and replied, "I want to protect what your mother and I built. If that means you hate me, then so be it. At least the truth will remain." Her eyes filled with something like rage and grief tangled together, and for a moment I saw the little girl she once was, standing in Margaret's kitchen, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. But that child was gone, replaced by a woman hardened by ambition, by fear, by a determination to control what cannot be controlled. She turned on her heel, Richard following like a shadow, and left without another word. That night I sat by the window, the necklace cool against my skin, and realized that the battle had entered its final stage. Ellen's motives were fully revealed now. Not just fear of embarrassment, not just a desire to manage appearances, but a deeper hunger to control the narrative of our family, to be the sole author of what was remembered and what was forgotten. And I knew that as long as I breathed, I would resist her, because to surrender would be to betray Margaret, to betray myself, and to betray the very idea of love as something worth carrying openly, no matter how inconvenient it might be for others. The final days before the court hearing were a blur of anticipation and cold resolve. I could feel the tension in my body, as if the air itself had thickened around me, pressing in on my chest with each breath. The lawyer had prepared everything, the documents laid out neatly, the will signed and notarized, the statements collected. Margaret's things were already arranged to be donated, her clothes packed into boxes, her photographs gathered in albums for safekeeping. It was as if I were setting her memory adrift, not in a way that felt like abandonment, but as a way to preserve it in a place where it would be protected, where it would be kept safe from the erasure that Ellen so desperately sought. I knew the fight was coming, that the legal battle to protect my autonomy would unfold soon, but something in the pit of my stomach told me this was the moment that would change everything. There was no going back after this. Once the truth was revealed, there could be no reconciliation, no easy way to return to the family dinners and polite smiles. This was the point of no return, and the only thing left to decide was how far I was willing to go to hold my ground. Ellen didn't call for several days. Her absence was more deafening than her presence, and it gnawed at my nerves, making me second-guess every decision I'd made. I'd never seen her so silent, so withdrawn. I couldn't decide whether it was fear, anger, or something more calculated. Perhaps she was waiting for me to cave, for me to reach out, to apologize, to take back the power I had so boldly claimed. But I refused. The day of the hearing arrived, and I dressed in my best suit, the one Margaret had always said made me look sharp, and I wore her necklace as I had every day since I had decided to fight. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry to me. It had become a symbol of resistance, of my refusal to be silenced, of my refusal to let my daughter control the narrative of my life, of my love, and of my memories. The courthouse was cold and impersonal. its walls heavy with the sound of people walking, the murmur of lawyers and plaintiffs whispering in corners. The room where the hearing would take place was sterile, its walls lined with dull gray and the furniture arranged in neat, calculated order. I sat there in the hard-backed chair, feeling every second stretch out before me as if time itself were watching with bated breath. I could feel the weight of the necklace around my neck, its gold cool and solid against my skin, and I knew in that moment that I had made the right decision. It was not just about the house, not just about the money, not even about the legal proceedings. It was about the truth. It was about not allowing my daughter to rewrite history, to erase the love and the sacrifices that had built this family, and to reduce Margaret to a shadow in a corner of her past. It was about standing up for the memory of a woman who had never been given the recognition she deserved, never given the space to be mourned, not just as a wife and mother, but as a person with a legacy of her own. I couldn't let her be erased, not by Ellen, not by anyone. When Ellen finally arrived, I could see the tension in her body, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked nervously around the room, avoiding contact with me. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her hair pulled back sharply, her expression carefully composed. She looked as though she had already decided the outcome of the hearing in her favor, but I could see the cracks beneath her exterior. Richard stood beside her, arms crossed, looking equally tense. But there was something else in his gaze. Something that made me wonder if he was starting to realize the depths of the situation, the emotional cost of what he had been complicit in. As they sat down across from me, I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, trying to read my expression, trying to gauge if I would falter, if I would give in. I didn't. The hearing began, and the judge, a stern woman in her 50s, looked over the documents before her with an air of professional detachment. She asked us both to present our cases, and Ellen spoke first, outlining the reasons why she felt I was no longer capable of managing my affairs, why she believed that my memory had begun to fail me, and that it was in my best interest to have someone, namely her, take over my financial and personal decisions. She spoke about the small lapses, the occasional forgetfulness, the moments when I had seemed confused or distant. She painted a picture of a man slowly slipping away, someone who no longer had the capacity to make sound judgments. Her words were calculated, each one delivered with the kind of precision that comes with years of practice. I could see the carefully constructed narrative she had built, the story she wanted the court to believe. That I was a burden, a man who had outlived his usefulness, whose memories were no longer reliable, and whose attachment to the past was a dangerous thing that could no longer be allowed to control his life. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath, holding the necklace lightly in my hand as I began. I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to shout. My words were calm, steady, and filled with the quiet force that comes from knowing you are right. I spoke about Margaret, about the life we had built together, and about the memories we had shared. I spoke about the love that had sustained us both, even after her death. I talked about the necklace, how it was not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of my connection to her, to our life, to everything I had ever valued. I didn't deny the lapses Ellen had mentioned, the moments when I had forgotten things or when my mind had wandered, but I explained that those were simply the natural effects of age, not the signs of someone unfit to care for himself. I spoke about the importance of holding on to the past, of not allowing it to be erased by those who didn't understand its value, and I made it clear that I would not allow my daughter to take control of my life simply because it was convenient for me, her. My voice never wavered, but I could see the change in Ellen's expression as I spoke. At first, there had been a flicker of defiance, but now that defiance was giving way to something else. Something I couldn't quite place. It was as if the weight of the truth was starting to sink in, as if the narrative she had carefully crafted was starting to crack under the pressure of my words. When I finished, there was a long silence in the courtroom. The judge looked over the documents once more, her expression unreadable, before she turned to the lawyers. "I will take everything into consideration and issue my decision shortly," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. The tension in the room remained palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and unfinished arguments. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on me, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back at Ellen or Richard. I didn't need to. I knew what I had done. I knew that for the first time in a long while I had stood up for myself, for Margaret, and for the memory that had always been mine to carry. I didn't need anyone's approval. I only needed the truth to speak for itself. The days following the court hearing were filled with a kind of heavy silence, a waiting game that stretched on as I sat in my living room, feeling the weight of the decision yet to come pressing on me. It was strange, really, how a single moment can alter the entire course of your life, and how in that moment you are suspended between the past and the future, unsure of what the outcome will be, but certain that everything will be different when it's over. I spent those days as I always had, moving through the routine of my life with a kind of quiet acceptance, though there was an undeniable undercurrent of anxiety, a sense that things were about to shift in a way I couldn't fully control. I would sit at my kitchen table in the mornings, my coffee cooling in my hands, looking at the spot where Margaret's chair once sat, imagining her there beside me, telling me that everything would be all right, even though I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. Ellen had not called since the hearing. Her silence was its own kind of punishment, a cold, deliberate removal of any pretense of concern or affection. I knew she was angry, but I also knew that she was calculating, that she was waiting for the right moment to reassert control. The waiting was the hardest part, though, because with each passing day, the realization settled deeper into me that the relationship we had once shared, the bond that had been built over decades, had fractured in ways that could not be undone. There were no more Sunday dinners, no more quiet visits where we shared memories of Margaret. There were only the brittle exchanges and the looming sense of finality that filled the space between us. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old photographs of Margaret and me, there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I hesitated before getting up to answer it. When I opened the door, I was surprised to find Anna standing there, her eyes red from crying, her hands wrapped tightly around the straps of her bag as if she were afraid to let go. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, looking at me as though she didn't know how to begin. I felt my heart tighten in my chest. "Anna," I said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "What's going on? What happened?" She stepped into the house without a word and sat down on the couch, her body hunched forward as if she were carrying some heavy burden. I sat beside her, but she didn't look up at me. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the silence thick between us, like we were both afraid to break it with the wrong words. Finally, she looked at me, her face a mixture of confusion and sorrow, and said, "Mom's not going to let up. She's going to keep pushing, and I don't know how to stop her. She wants everything to go back to the way it was, and she's using me to do it." Her words were quiet, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how much she could say without betraying her mother. I could feel the tension in her body, the weight of the choice she had been forced to make. "I never wanted any of this," she continued, her voice breaking, "but I don't know what else to do. I can't keep choosing sides, Grandpa." Her words hung in the air like a confession, like a wound she didn't know how to heal. I reached out to take her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the way she seemed so small in that moment, like a child caught in the middle of something much larger than she could comprehend. "You don't have to choose, Anna," I said gently, my voice firm yet filled with compassion. "This isn't your battle. You're not the one who has to fight for the truth, but I want you to know something. Your grandmother would have been proud of you, proud of the way you've held on to what matters, even when everything around you feels like it's falling apart." Her tears came then, the floodgates opening. For a moment, I held her tightly, as if the weight of everything could be shared between us. She cried for Margaret, for the loss of a woman who had been more than just a grandmother to her, for the pain of watching her family tear itself apart over something as simple as memory. And I cried with her, not because I felt sorry for myself, but because I realized that in this moment there was still love between us, still something worth saving. The conflict between Ellen and me had driven a wedge between us, but Anna was a reminder that there was something deeper, something that couldn't be taken away. When the tears subsided, Anna pulled back slightly and looked at me, her face still flushed from crying, but her eyes clearer. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, knowing that the road ahead would not be easy, but also knowing that it was the only road left to follow. "Now, we stand firm," I said quietly. "We keep what's ours. We protect the things that matter, the memories that define us, even if it costs us everything. You don't have to fight for me, Anna. But I'm asking you to remember. That's all I need. Remember what was real, what was good." She nodded, her expression softening as if the weight of her decision had lifted, even just a little. "I'll remember," she whispered, squeezing my hand before standing up and walking toward the door. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I wish things could be different." I nodded, watching her leave, feeling the distance between us widen once again, but this time it wasn't the distance of conflict. It was the distance of time, of growing up, of the inevitable separation that happens when children become adults and find their own path. But there was still a connection, still something that remained. After Anna left, I sat alone in the quiet of the house, looking at the spot where she had just stood. The weight of the necklace around my neck seemed heavier now, as if it too had absorbed the tension of the day. But it was also a comfort, a reminder that I had not been completely abandoned. Margaret's memory and the love that had once filled this house was not gone. It lived in the moments I had shared with my granddaughter, in the letters I had written, in the decisions I had made to preserve what mattered. The road ahead was uncertain, and I had no illusions that the battle with Ellen was over. But I had fought for the right to remember, for the right to carry my past with me, and in that fight I had not lost everything. Perhaps not even close. I knew the final decision was still coming, and whatever happened, it would change the shape of our family, forever. But at that moment, I understood that the real victory wasn't in winning or losing. It was in standing firm, in holding on to the truth, and in refusing to let go of what was dear, no matter what the cost.